introduced to mankind the concentration camp that subsequently killed 78,000 women, children, and old men who were Boers, something for which the British Prime Minister Campbell-Bannerman subsequently apologized in 1905, much to the consternation of the British people who said that they would not apologize for anything. Sound familiar? They learned some things. They learned the value of aimed rifle fire. They learned the value of organizing permanent headquarters. In those days, headquarters were ad hoc. That meant that regiments were brought together, brigaded together, as they said. Then they would put together an ad hoc brigade headquarters, ad hoc division headquarters, and so forth. Those things are fixed, and fixed very, very well. But the problem is that that's about it. The criticality of artillery fire, particularly indirect artillery fire, is completely ignored. Even though they've got lots of airplanes to work with and motorization, they really don't explore it very much. And they don't take the lessons of the far more important Russo-Japanese War seriously. Because in the Russo-Japanese War, you're talking about hundreds of thousands of troops and 100,000 casualties on the Japanese side, a couple of 100,000 on the Russian side, where you see machine guns and barbed wire and artillery and trenches, and these things are completely ignored. And one of the reasons they're ignored is, well, after all, these are Japanese. They're not white people, which, of course, is absurd today to say such a thing. But at the time, that was one of the attitudes. So they didn't look very carefully at those things, and that was part of the problem when they get to 1914. And by the way, there was no meritocracy when it came to advancing officers. You were very lucky if you got a good officer. In most cases, the officer wasn't terribly interested in what happened. He was busy playing polo or something else. So these things are things that Haldane could not change. Now, when we look at our army today and the British Army, and one of the reasons I wrote that chapter is that we are very similar. We have an army today where there's almost no one who has had the experience of real warfare. In fact, as I was driving in today with one of the men who was with me in 1991, a mortarman who's sitting over here, he made the same observation. I asked one of the officers who was with me, who later commanded the 3rd Cavalry Regiment, what was your experience in Iraq compared with what you experienced in 91? And he said, a firefight never lasted for more than 2 or 3 minutes. We fought for 6 or 7 hours. The enemy knew that if it stayed for any length of time, it would be annihilated by superior firepower, aircraft, or something else. So we have an army right now that is very similar to the pre-World War I British Army. And we have a lot of people in that army, at the top of the army, who are very reluctant to consider the possibility that they may actually have to fight someone who can fight back. They're very comfortable going to Africa, Latin America, the Middle East, or Southeast Asia, and running training exercises, or what we call live fire exercises with real people. Exercises that don't involve fighting a capable enemy. In fact, I'm personally very concerned right now because we have a lot of those light forces sitting up on the border with Turkey right now, and the Turkish army has massed 50,000 troops on the other side. And the Turks have hundreds of tanks and thousands of guns and are extremely competent. And if they were to intervene and we happen to be in the way when they decide to exterminate the Kurds, we're going to lose a lot of people because we're not prepared for any of it. So we're in a very bad situation right now. When it comes to the idea of volunteers or professional versus the citizen soldier, that's another issue. The problem we have today is that the level of competence, the level of training that's required, the quality of the human capital that you need is so high that anyone who doesn't serve for at least 3 to 4 years is probably not going to bring much value to you in a war, because it's that complex. The technology is that demanding. The training is that demanding. And of course, that means that if you're only going to have an army of 500,000 or less, you've got to make some tough decisions about what you're going to build and maintain, because you have 70,000 men in Special Operations Command. You have 250,000 Marines. Or excuse me, 180,000 Marines. You put the two together, you have 250,000 Marines and soldiers, airmen, sailors. They're all committed to low-intensity conflict. That's what they do. So the question is, if that entire vast array of manpower and equipment is committed to low-intensity warfare, what are you doing with the Army? Because you have to take another 110,000 out of the Army right away for institutional training and this kind of business. You end up with, we have 190,000 soldiers in 40 countries right now performing these low-intensity warfare tasks. That leaves you with maybe 150 to 170,000 troops. That's it. That's all you've got here sitting in the United States with which you could actually build a fighting force. And we're not doing it. Absolutely not doing it.
I appreciate what you're saying in terms of a large fighting force, but it seems like in modern wars, these large fighting forces have been ineffective against guerrilla wars, starting with Vietnam, looking at Iraq, the second war, not Desert Storm, Afghanistan, 17 years we've been there, 15 years, whatever it is, Iraq, as I mentioned. So what does the accumulation of a large military force, what's the benefit of that in terms of these types of guerrilla wars against the Taliban or whomever?
Did I argue for a large force?
I thought so.
No. Nowhere in the book, and I'm not arguing for one now. I'm arguing for a much better, more lethal professional force. But let's attack your question because it's a very important one. Back to purpose, method, end state. The men who took you into Vietnam in 1965 convinced each other. In fact, we have letters from McGeorge Bundy and McNamara writing to each other saying, well, we may not win in Vietnam, but we know it's the morally right thing to do. We have hundreds of people in Washington right now who are saying, well, we know that we may not win this long war, and we've had lots of mistakes, and it hasn't gone well, but staying in Afghanistan and staying in Iraq and getting into Syria is the morally right thing to do. No one in 1965 and no one in 2003, no one in 1991 said, what's the purpose of this? What are we trying to do? Well, we were initially told, for instance, in Afghanistan, that we went in there to deal with about 500 to 600 people, led by someone called Osama bin Laden. We failed. We didn't kill him. We did not destroy those people. They escaped into Pakistan. How could that happen? We spend billions of dollars to maintain the National Security Agency. We spend billions on Special Operations Command. We have satellites following rodents on the side of the road. Well, how could this possibly happen? And then why didn't we deploy any troops on the ground quickly to ensure they could not escape? Where was the Army? Where was the Marine Corps? Why weren't they there? Who is responsible for this debacle? Was he relieved? No. And the man who was responsible for that failure was Tommy Franks. And the Chief of Staff of the Army said, I'm not sending any troops. I can't send anything for at least 6 months, and I'm not sending just a few hundred. I have to send an entire division, and then I have to send an entire Corps headquarters. That's the way we do business. So that was failure number one. Failure number two comes in 2003, and since I was part of that failure and planned the advance on Baghdad for Secretary Rumsfeld, I can speak pretty authoritatively on the subject. I was brought in because the generals wanted what I call the million-man march to Baghdad. And of course, I had seen a lot of action with my unit in 1991, and I went in there and I said, look, most of these Arabs are not going to fight very hard. They're not terribly interested in fighting very hard. They particularly don't care about Saddam Hussein. You know, the old expression, all politics are local, that Tip O'Neill used to swing around. Well, in the Middle East, everything is local. And I said, what we really need to do is get to Baghdad very quickly, ignore everything en route, get there quickly and get Saddam and this crowd. And we had special operators who were supposed to help do that. And then we put a new group of generals in power. And Rumsfeld agreed. Other people thought that was the right thing to do. And then tell them to tell the UN when they're going to hold elections at some point in the distant future. But the Iraqi army had to be rapidly reconstituted or kept intact. Because one of the things that we learned in Afghanistan was that if you had a trash bag full of cash, the people you just fought for a little cash were happy to join up and go with you. And that avoided a lot of trouble. We could have done the same thing with the Iraqi army. Now, a decision was then made Much further down the road, primarily as a result of Mr. Wolfowitz, or Dr. Wolfowitz's influence with President Bush, he walked into the office and said, Mr. President, we have an unusual opportunity here. And he had President Cheney with him. We have the opportunity to build the first liberal democracy in the Arab world that will be friendly to Israel. Well, if you believe that, I've got swampland all over the planet that I'd like to sell you. And by the way, I made that comment and I was told, you're a racist because you're suggesting that the Arabs can't maintain an effective liberal democracy. And I said, it has nothing to do with race. It has to do with thousands of years of culture, the nature of these people, tribalism, right down the line. And we have a central government. It's the Iraqi army and administration. Under a new group of generals, we can hold the place together. If you remove it, we're in a lot of trouble. I wasn't the only one. But I would have nothing to do with the occupation because I said it's a disaster and it will produce nothing but disaster for the region, for us. And so I was thanked for my interest in national defense, retired as a colonel in 2004. My point to you is that those decisions were decisions from which it was almost impossible to recover. Occupations, in the words of Genghis Khan, turn soldiers into jailers. You don't want to occupy anything, particularly in that part of the world, when you are viewed, whether you wear an American uniform, a British uniform, doesn't matter, you're a European Christian force trying to occupy a Muslim people. Impossible. Can't be done. It's a prescription for catastrophe. But that was what we did. Now, the second part is that once we did it, just before I retired, I was called to the Hill, and I sat with members of the House Armed Services Committee, wanted my views on this place called Fallujah. Remember that? It broke out in April and May. And they said, what do you think we should do? And I said, bring every tank, bring every gun, and systematically reduce Fallujah, block by block. Oh, well, we could never do that. We would hurt these civilians and everything else. And I said, well, then withdraw. Because if you do not crush this demonstrably in a very brutal and open way, it will get worse. And our soldiers, God bless them, sailors, Marines,